There's a lot of criticism of China from the standpoint of, okay, you're trying to get rich, that's fine, okay, but you're basically trying to get rich on the backs of everyone else in the world by running this gigantic manufacturing export machine where it seems like the Chinese ambition is to produce all the manufactured goods in the world for everyone, run an enormous trade surplus, which means that they are depending on other people's buying power to support them, and that this is basically not fair, not sustainable, not a stable way to participate in the global economy. So that's more of a question not of if China does get rich, but how does it get rich? Does it get rich by essentially operating on the same rules as everyone else and having a market that other people can participate in, or does it grow rich by essentially making it impossible for anyone else in the world to have the kind of production structure that they want to have and relying entirely on these ever-growing trade surpluses? In general, in principle, from a welfare standpoint, it would be great if China got to be, as rich as everywhere else in the world, even as rich as America. But that is likely to have some pretty difficult and destabilizing political consequences because of the vast differences between the Chinese political system and the U.S. political system and the political systems of all the other major industrialized countries. I think there are a couple of things beneath that. One is the systemic difference politically is really important, right? So the U.S. self-identity is of the leader of democracies around the world. And we are very invested, at least for now, in our democratic system. We'll see how that evolves over the next 2 or 3 years. There's some question marks around that. But historically, that's been a really huge part of the U.S. identity. And basically, the morality play of World War II and the Cold War, which has really been the crucible in which U.S. foreign policy has been formed, is that you had an alliance of democracies that fought back first against fascism, then against communism. They won. And the result was that you created a world where, most major countries were democratic. They operated on market economic systems, and we were heading towards sort of a world of convergence of systems where everyone's essentially playing by the same rules. And China really gets in the way of that narrative because it is an incredibly successful authoritarian system where the ruling party still calls itself communist. U.S. elites have never, to this day, really gotten comfortable with the idea that the Chinese political system is legitimate, right? And as long as you have that kind of underlying problem, I think it's going to be very difficult to erase these difficulties. And then on the economic side, I think it is a problem, the way that China has chosen to organize its economy. Yeah, in a strictly financial sense, if you will, the rest of the world comes out ahead in the sense that China is willing to subsidize a lot of low-cost production, so the rest of the world gets a lot of cheap goods, and the overall welfare of the world improves a lot. I think that's clearly true. But I think if you look at what has happened to the U.S. politically over the last 20 years, there are a lot of flies in that ointment. And the fly is that it is important for large countries to be able to maintain a diversified production structure and maintain kind of social cohesion. And if you lose the capacity to run a manufacturing economy that employs large numbers of people, there's a lot of disruptions that come as a result of that. And the purely financialized economy that we had grow up in the United States in the early 2000s as a result of this bargain with China wound up being pretty bad for the social compact. So I think there is a legitimate question about how do you integrate China's growing power, wealth, industrial might into a world in a way that societies around the world can tolerate, right? And it's a legitimately difficult problem. And I think a lot of the problems have to do not with China, but with U.S. domestic policy. So I think a lot of what's going on right now is scapegoating of China as a way of diverting attention from decisions that need to be made domestically about income redistribution and macroeconomic policy and so forth. But there is also, I think, a legitimate question to be made about China now accounts for 20% of the global economy, probably will be larger in future, a third of the global manufacturing economy. there has to be an agreed set of rules about how it interacts with the rest of the world so that everyone feels that they are benefiting, not just in financial terms. And we don't really have that agreement now. Essentially, is a Cold War the right, framing for whatever this conflict is that we have with China? And my answer to that is absolutely not. And you can address that question both empirically and conceptually. So empirically, if you just look at patterns of trade and investment during the Cold War, the actual Cold War with Russia, the Soviet Union never accounted for more than about 1% of U.S. trade, and investment flows were basically non-existent. China, at its peak about 10 years ago, accounted for 17% of U.S. trade, which is about the same amount as Japan did in the late 80s and early 90s. And that number has come down a little bit on the surface, but when you take account of stuff from China coming in through third countries and so forth, basically that remains the same. So it's just, and then if you talk about investment flows, there's $600 billion or more of U.S. corporate investment in China, which generates huge amounts of sales, much larger than U.S. exports to China. So the integration of the two economies is just extraordinary. There's basically no precedent for it at any point in economic history. And it is just a completely different order of magnitude to what was going on during the Cold War. So, one question would be okay, if you really want a Cold War, does that mean that what you want to do is you want to reduce those trade and investment flows back down to essentially zero? And if so, how do you do that, right? So that's a very difficult problem. But I think you got at sort of the more core conceptual issue, which is how does this end? This does not end by China going away or turning into something completely different. It's too big. It is too successful. The economic model is successful on its own terms, has a lot of problems, but it's fundamentally successful. And it is deeply integrated with the entire global economy in ways that are beneficial for China and beneficial for most of the other countries in the world. So everyone has some sort of a stake in China continuing to succeed. And so this is just not going to go away. And the other sense in which it's not going to go away is, let's say you could wave a magic wand and make the Communist Party of China disappear tomorrow and replace it with something else. What would that something else look like? Well, if that something else were to be successful at governing China, it would almost certainly share many of the characteristics of the Chinese Communist Party. It would have a strong determination for China to be an independent geopolitical actor, taking care of its own security with very strong military so that it could defend itself against all of its real and perceived security threats. It would be committed, as every Chinese government since the mid-19th century has been, to maximizing the rate of technological progress and making sure that as much as possible of China's core technology needs were met by domestic production rather than imports. It would be very, very similar to what we have today. So it's a fantasy to think that what we have a problem here is just this particular regime, right, and you could just get them to change their minds. No, the sort of Chinese approach on this is very deeply rooted in both the institutional cultural history of China itself and its position, its geographical and geopolitical position in the world. And so it's going to have interests that create a lot of friction and conflict with the perceived interests of the United States under any government. And it's probably going to be quite successful at managing its economy because they've been very successful for many, many decades. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of people in China who would say, well, no, we want it all and we can. So why should we make that deal with you, right? So if I take this down basically to the level on which the United States and China are now starting to negotiate, right? My personal view on this would be that it would make a lot of sense for the U.S. to be much, much more open to a direct investment by Chinese companies in manufacturing in the United States. And I'm thinking, particularly things like electric vehicles, that whole supply chain, green energy, industrial automation, all of those things. Why do I think that? Well, first of all, I think if the U.S. is serious about revitalizing its industrial base, and I think there's a good case for trying to do that selectively, it is not going to happen unless you invite in the world's leading players and have them compete.
Yeah.
That is how China industrialized. 45 years ago, they were an industrial basket case, basically. They said, we want to get industrially strong. How do we do that? We get all the leading companies in the world to invest here, and we all learn from them. And that's how you do it. So if we're serious about that, we should be serious about figuring out ways that we can bring Chinese industrial investment into the United States. And that, to me, would be a win-win, because Chinese companies at an individual level would love that. They see the U.S. as a huge market. They can't get into it right now. They would love the opportunity to tap into it more. We could learn from them. And if you did that, basically you would be saying, whatever we're in with China, it's not a Cold War, because we are willing to have high levels of direct investment by both sides. And you might want to put protections around that, all kinds of rules of the road. But in an ideal world, I think we would have a lot more of that. Now, first question is why is that so difficult? Why do you essentially have a consensus in Washington that not only do we have to prevent the export of U.S. technology goods to China, but we also have to prevent Chinese companies from investing in the U.S.? This is basically agreed on in Washington. And the reason is data. Fundamentally, there is a view that any manufacturing process today is also a data creation machine. And where does that data go, and who benefits from that data? And the other thing is that it used to be, back 30 or 40 years ago, you could divide the world into most technologies which were essentially for civilian use, a few technologies that were military, and then a very, very small proportion of technologies, dual-use technologies, that could go either way. And it was those dual-use technologies that had to be controlled very carefully. Now, basically, everything is dual-use. Any technology that you can imagine can be put to some kind of military use. So it becomes much more risky to have these patterns of investment, particularly when you don't know where the data is flowing and how that will feed into someone else's defense production base. And I think that is a legitimate concern. And so in my ideal world, you would have a lot more Chinese investment in the United States, but it would be very carefully regulated. In the same way that China very carefully regulates the direct investments by foreign companies in its economy. They have very strict rules about data localization, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that could be achieved. I think it will be very, very difficult in the current political environment. And then just in terms of the sort of the grand bargain that you suggest, is, China is very interested in not being pigeonholed. They didn't want to be pigeonholed in low value added manufacturing. They wanted to do the high tech stuff. Now they're doing that. They don't want to be pigeonholed in manufacturing. They want all of technology, including AI. So I don't think that any strategy which is premised on the idea that China should accept arbitrary limits on what it can do is viable. Yeah. Because would we accept that? Absolutely not. And so why should we expect them to accept something that we would consider an absurd and completely unreasonable infringement on our sovereignty? Yeah. It just doesn't work that way. So if you go back to the early 1990s, China recognized that pretty much every other country that had gotten rich had done so in large part by building up an automotive industry that then served as a mechanism for creating innovations in other sectors. You look at the US, you look at Germany, you look at Japan, you look even at Korea, which is very successful. So they said, okay, we have to have a big auto industry. This is one of the key industries that we have to support. So starting in the early 1990s, they had this strategy of bringing in foreign companies, making them do joint ventures on a 50-50 basis with Chinese auto companies. And the theory was that eventually the Chinese companies would learn, and then you would be able to, develop your own national champion auto companies and, kick the foreigners out, right? And basically this failed. It failed massively. Over the next 25 years, foreign companies came in, General Motors, VW, Toyota, Honda and so forth. And they did very, very well. And the joint venture partners in China basically just sat around and clipped coupons from the dividends that these companies, that these joint ventures were producing. All of the technological inputs continuously came from the foreign partners. All of the design ideas that the local partners just were never able to succeed. And in volume terms, you had a lot of smaller scale, locally sponsored vehicle companies in China building kind of low-end vehicles. So a lot of the cars that wound up getting made in China were made by local firms. But if you look at the share of profits and total value in the system, it was dominated by these joint ventures, which were in turn dominated by the foreign partners. So China, circa 2010, 2015, had been doing this for 25 years, and they were basically no closer to having globally competitive conventional car makers than they had been 25 years before. So in the late 2000s, so 2005, 2010, they started thinking, well, this and other related kind of industrial policies are not working very well. We are not generating the national champions that we thought that we were going to do. So what do we do about this? And their answer was leapfrog. Let's try and figure out what is the next stage of technological development that people really aren't working on yet. Let's work on that, and then maybe we can get in on the ground floor. And so what they came up with, in large measure, was renewable energy, specifically electric vehicles. But still, when you got to 2018, 2019, BYD was still not that exciting a company. Most people in China really didn't want to buy electric vehicles. They seemed really inconvenient. The sexy cars were like the big SUVs that the joint ventures were putting out and so forth. And then in 2018, the Chinese government made the decision that they would allow Tesla to come in and build a wholly owned gigafactory in Shanghai. They had never approved a wholly owned automotive company before. They started cranking out cars in 2019, which became immensely popular. And it seems like one of the things that happened was that the Chinese companies by 2019 had gotten pretty good at the underlying technology of electric cars, specifically the batteries and then the software systems that govern the cars. But they were terrible at consumer design. They had not figured out how to make these appealing products that people would want to buy. And Tesla did have appealing products that people wanted to buy. They were big status symbols. So BYD and its competitors said, okay, this is the part we have to figure out. How do we achieve this? And basically, they recognized that they had to up their design game. They, among other things, went to Germany and loaded up on a lot of German car designers that were able to transform their kind of technology base into much more appealing packages. And then by 2022 or so, they were, able to compete with Tesla both on price and on quality. So, I think what that shows you is that, number one, the Chinese government made a pretty good bet on this kind of leapfrogging idea that there are technologies of the future. We need to get in early, subsidize the heck out of them. Some of the estimates that have been made about the level of subsidies given to the EV industry and related supply chains, it's $200 or $300 billion, huge amounts of money that did not generate that much of a return, financial return, for a really long time. But they stuck at it. And then the thing that finally flipped the switch was this catalytic foreign investment that showed the Chinese companies what they needed to do to actually compete in the consumer market. And then they got very good at that very quickly. I guess I would start by emphasizing the ways in which China is very, very different than Japan. The sort of central thing that is really different, that lies at the root of a lot of this, is that China is an independent geopolitical actor and Japan was not. Japan, at the end of the day, they could rely on the U.S. for security. They were demilitarized. China basically is on its own. They're in a very dangerous neighborhood. They have 14 land neighbors that they share borders with. They have names like North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, a lot of dangerous actors. Several of them have nuclear weapons, North Korea, Russia, Pakistan, and India. So China, just in a very narrow sense, lives in a very dangerous neighborhood. And so they quite legitimately have, I think, some pretty significant national security needs. And they also have aspirations to be a great power, and they want to do it on their own. So the incentive to get things right is much more existential in China than it was in Japan. Japan essentially could take the choice to sort of say, oh, well, we're going to have a stagnant economy and that's bad and whatever, but actually we'll be fine, right? And for China, it's not fine, right? So there is underlying it, I think there's a spur that increases the chances that the Chinese leaders will do the things that they need to do to keep the system more dynamic. It's not a guarantee, but it's a pretty strong incentive. Right? But then if you look at some of the specifics, so the big difference between the way that China and Japan are economically organized is essentially the relationship between the financial and the corporate sector. So Japan had this system where banks owned equity in these giant industrial companies and in the trading companies, and vice versa. There were these cross shareholdings, which meant that it was essentially the entire economy of Japan, the entire corporate and financial sector had one big balance sheet. And all of that balance sheet rested by the late 1980s on land values that had just gotten completely detached from any form of reality. There was an investment thesis among investors who were, playing the Japanese stock market in the late 80s that you did not look at the earnings of the Japanese companies. Those were irrelevant. What you looked at was the value of the land that they controlled. So essentially a capital ratio where you assumed that this, the value of their underlying land capital was a permanent contribution to their wealth and prosperity. And so the valuations of these stocks, which got, again, crazy, you couldn't justify them by earnings. They say, well, it doesn't matter because the land that they're sitting on is so valuable. Then the land values collapsed by 80%. The stock values had to collapse by a similar amount, 80%. And everyone was holding shares in one another. So the banks, their capital got eroded because a lot of their capital was tied up in the land and in the stocks, which were collateralized by land. And so they were unable to lend. They just had to deleverage as fast as possible. The companies had to deleverage fast as possible. And so the entire economy got engulfed by this phenomenon of debt deflation, which basically means that in the act of paying down the debt, because you're doing fire sales of assets, you're reducing the prices of those assets, introducing deflation. So the real value of your debt continues to grow even as you are supposedly reducing it because of the deflationary effect. It's very, very difficult to get out of. China does not have this problem at all because they looked at the problems that Japan got into. They looked at similar problems that Korea had in the late 1990s, and they said, we will never allow this kind of cross-shareholding between financial companies and corporations. This is way too dangerous. So they have kept the two quarantined. It is illegal for industrial companies to own a bank. They are allowed, the bigger ones are allowed to have internal financing subsidiaries, but they can only sort of manage financing flows within the group. And it is also illegal for banks to load up on shares of industrial companies, right? So you have a distinct financial system and industrial system, which means that the particular type of macro problem that Japan got into is very, very unlikely to occur in China today. So you have huge debt problems, right? So the property developer is very over-leveraged, huge problem. You've had a massive property crash in China over the last 5 years. That is a big, big problem. You have local governments that, borrowed a lot of money, invested in infrastructure, which is now delivering very low returns. They have a big debt problem. So you have very substantial debt problems in China that have significant negative macro consequences, but they're all isolated and they can be dealt with in sort of one by one. If you look at the industrial sector, it's not very highly leveraged. Debt levels, in fact, are not high. Most private companies in China have learned for many years they couldn't get access to bank credit because the banks only wanted to lend to state-owned enterprises, which were secure. They had physical collateral and they had a state guarantee. Private companies for years have learned to make do basically financing their investment out of retained earnings, and their leverage ratios are not that high. They're creeping up now over the last few years because of the big industrial policy push, but fundamentally they're in a very different position than the Japanese companies were. I guess my view on this is that this local government land-based financing model was actually a pretty smart thing to do initially, and for a decade or so, it worked quite well. Local governments were sitting on a lot of these land assets. It was perfectly the land assets originally were undervalued quite substantially, and so it made sense for the local governments essentially to try and capitalize some of the future value of these things and use them to finance infrastructure development. This was not sort of a rogue policy that local governments came up with on their own. It was actually sponsored by the central government and the China Development Bank back in the early 2000s, which was grappling with the problem that China at that point had a severe shortage of housing and infrastructure of all kinds, including urban infrastructure. And the question was like, we need a lot more of this stuff. How do we build it? How do we finance it? And they realized, oh, actually, as we build this stuff out, the values of this land are going to skyrocket. So let's, essentially take some financing against that future land price appreciation and use that to build the infrastructure that makes everything possible. And if you look at the first few cases of where this was done in the early 2000s, they had these estimates of what the land would ultimately be worth that seemed ridiculous and astronomical at the time. They were, in fact, way too low. They were way, way conservative on what the actual land price appreciation would be. So you had a period of about 8 or 9 years where essentially the development banks, the state-run development banks, were doing this in a fairly controlled way, very, very successfully. And then what happened was that after the 2008 financial crisis, the government said, oh, we just have to spend a lot of money to gin up growth because there's been this global economic catastrophe. And so they did a massive cash infusion into the banks and to the state-owned enterprises. It said, spend, 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 and basically all infrastructure is good infrastructure, just like build whatever you want. And so what happened at that point was that all of the commercial banks got into this business of lending money to local governments for these infrastructure projects. And their underwriting standards were much less robust than the China development banks had been. And so the local governments just, it was free money to them. So they just took all the money and they ran with it. And then that created this kind of Frankenstein's monster. Even so, I think you had quite a lot of that money in the first few years went into, probably generated a pretty good return because China was still underbuilt relative to what it needed to be. But after that had run for 3 or 4 years, it became clear that a lot of this was going into wasteful projects and it didn't deliver good return. And now they've been struggling for the last decade for how to unwind that. But I think it's important to understand that the underlying model was actually an okay model. It just wound up being done in a way that was completely uncoordinated and excessive and led to a lot of, you didn't have incentive structures that enable local governments to, rein it in when they needed to, right? So I still think that is fundamentally, that is a local government fiscal problem, which ultimately is a central government fiscal problem. If you look at the consolidated balance sheet of the central and local governments, put them all together, China's government debt is still probably less as a share of GDP than U.S. federal government debt, right? The U.S. is over 100%. China is probably under 100%. They're not successful enough. I thought one of the problems in the world that we're facing today is that they're too successful at too many things and that this is creating difficulties for other people. So yeah, that has come up, from time to time. And during the period in the 90s and 2000s where they were growing at 10% a year, which is the fastest growth rate recorded by any economy in the history of mankind. And they were doing it just not for 1 or 2 years, but for 20 years in a row. People will often say, well, there's all this waste and there's too much state-owned enterprises, and they could grow much faster if they were just more efficient. And it's like, really? Could they? They're already growing faster than anyone has grown before.
Right.
Is it really the case that they could have grown a lot faster than they have? And maybe, but I doubt it. And the reason is, I think there's what I would call kind of an efficiency fallacy, which is that economists who, remember, have all been basically, all global economists, macroeconomists have been trained in the United States, since the end of World War II and in particularly since, the 1990s, right? And so they view sort of the U.S. in its developed state as the norm, rather than as the result of other processes. So it's like the way we operate now is the way we got here. And actually that's not quite the case, right? The reason China was able to grow so fast for so long was that they were able to mobilize these huge swaths of resources, domestic savings, and throw them in a kind of uncoordinated way at a lot of problems. And there was a lot of waste along the way. That was part of the equation. So if they had tried to be maximally efficient and said, no, we're not going to allow banks to lend unless they can prove that this project is definitely going to have an ROI of X, they would have lended a lot less. And they would probably have had a lot less growth because they were not willing simply to create that wall of money that would create broad-based growth. And they might, in fact, have had substantially more inequality than they did because this wasteful method allowed them to spread out investment in a lot of areas which were geographically disadvantaged, which might not have done so well in a purely efficiency-driven system. So I think we need to be careful about assuming that inefficiency is bad. I think inefficiency sometimes can be, as long as it is basically the result of a desire to be effective, that can be sort of a byproduct of a successful growth story. And I think that's basically my account of China.